My sister looked at my son and said, "Some children are just born defective." Then took a bite like she'd said nothing. My son put his fork down. I stared at her and said, "And some mothers live off the kindness of the ones they mock." He went pale. Mom whispered, "Let it go." But I turned to my sister and said, "You don't live in my house anymore." My name's Scarlett, I'm 38, and I can tell you the exact moment I stopped protecting people who didn't deserve it. It happened in my own house, the house I'd bought after years of sacrifice, during a Christmas dinner that should have felt warm and safe. Instead, it was the moment something cracked wide open. Something I'd been trying to hold together for too long. When I bought this house, I was proud. 2 bedrooms upstairs, a guest room, a finished basement. More than enough space for me and my son. I finally felt like I could breathe. I pictured quiet weekends, hot tea, maybe baking cookies together while snow piled up outside. But about a month after we moved in, my parents called. They told me Brianna and her husband were in a rough spot. He lost his job, their lease ended, and they had nowhere to go. "Just for a while," they said. "You have room." I was raised to help family, so I said yes. That was my first mistake. Brianna, 35, has always been the type who thinks every inconvenience in her life is someone else's fault. She moved in with her husband, their 2 kids, and enough boxes to fill a storage unit. I cleared out the guest room and made space. I even bought extra groceries. For the first few days it felt manageable. But then the comments started. She told me the kitchen was too small for real cooking. She didn't like how I did laundry. She'd rearrange things in the fridge, complain that my cleaning products smelled cheap. And once I caught her calling my son awkward behind his back. My son is 11. He's gentle, bright, a little shy. He's had poor eyesight since he was 4 and wears glasses full time. He's the kind of kid who apologizes if he sneezes too loud. And slowly I started noticing that he'd stopped spending time downstairs. One night I asked him what was wrong. He just said he didn't like how Brianna's son talked to him. I tried brushing it off as kids being kids. That was my second mistake. It got worse. Her older kid mocked my son for holding books too close to his face. They'd hide his glasses, laugh at the way he squinted. And Brianna? She'd just shrug and say he needed to toughen up. My parents? They kept telling me to be patient. It's temporary, they kept saying, as if that made it okay. So when Christmas rolled around and they all insisted we celebrate together, I gave in. I roasted the ham. I made my son's favorite sweet potatoes. I set the table with the best plates I had. I even lit candles. Everyone sat down. My son was sitting next to me, finally smiling, finally talking about the telescope he'd seen online. Then as he reached for a roll, his elbow knocked over a glass of water. It spilled across the table right in front of Brianna. She didn't even blink. She just looked at my son and said, "Some children are just born defective." Then she picked up her fork, took a bite like she hadn't just said something revolting. My son froze. Fork still in his hand. He slowly put it down. Didn't say a word. And I just saw red. I looked right at her and said, "And some mothers live off the kindness of the ones they mock." He went still. My mom immediately leaned toward me, told me to let it go. But I was done. I turned to Brianna and said it again, louder, like I needed it to echo. "You don't live in my house anymore." Her husband leaned back and muttered something, told me to shut my mouth. I ignored him. Stood up, gathered my son's plate and walked to the kitchen. The silence behind me said everything. But what none of them knew yet was that I meant it. They weren't staying. I didn't care where they went or what excuses they came up with. They were leaving. They didn't leave that night. I think that was the part that shocked me the most. After everything that was said at that table, after my son walked away without eating, they still acted like nothing had changed. The next morning I woke up early out of habit. I made coffee and stood in the kitchen, listening to footsteps upstairs that weren't mine. That sound used to make me feel less alone. That day it just made me tired. I didn't speak to Brianna. I didn't speak to her husband. I packed their things instead. I started with the guest room. Their clothes were everywhere. Toys under the bed. Shoes piled by the closet like they planned on staying forever. I boxed everything neatly, not because they deserved it but because I wanted it done cleanly. By mid-morning the boxes were stacked by the front door. My son stayed in his room. He came out once to get cereal, kept his eyes on the floor and went right back in. That alone told me I'd waited too long to act. Around noon, Brianna walked into the kitchen like it was any other day. She opened the fridge, looked around and asked if there was any pie left from dinner. I didn't respond. She asked what my issue was. I told her she needed to leave. Today. She laughed and said I was still upset over her comment. He called it a joke. Said I needed to relax and stop being dramatic. I told her it stopped being a joke when my son asked me that morning if something was wrong with him. I told her it stopped being a joke when he stopped wanting to come downstairs. She shrugged and said kids needed thicker skin. Then she said something about him being fragile and how that wasn't her responsibility. That was it. I picked up her car keys from the counter and put them in her hand. I told her to get her husband and start packing what was left. I said there would be no more discussions. Her husband showed up less than an hour later. He raised his voice. Said they had rights. Said they helped with groceries. Said my parents would never forgive me for this. I told him the house was mine. I told him there was no lease. I told him they were guests who had overstayed and crossed a line they could not step back from. He told me to watch my mouth. I told him to watch the clock. They packed loudly on purpose. Doors slammed. Boxes dragged across the floor. Brianna made phone calls where she spoke just loud enough for me to hear. She talked about how she tried to help me. How ungrateful I was. How my son was the real problem and no one wanted to say it. My parents arrived before they finished loading the car. My mom cried. She said this was tearing the family apart. She said Christmas was ruined. She asked me why I couldn't just be the bigger person. I told her I had been the bigger person since the day they moved in. I told her I was done paying for it. They left just after dark. I watched from the window as their car pulled away. My son stood next to me, silent, holding his sleeves over his hands. That night was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in months. I thought that was the end. 2 days later, I went into the basement to grab the Christmas decorations. The light wouldn't turn on. I checked another switch. Nothing. I went to the breaker panel and saw something didn't look right. An electrician came later that afternoon. He didn't stay long. He told me someone had deliberately damaged the wiring. Not an accident. Not wear and tear. He asked if anyone else had access to the house recently. I didn't have to answer out loud. That was when I realized kicking them out hadn't been the final move. It was just the first one. After the electrician left, I sat in the basement for a long time. No noise. No lights. Just the quiet hum of the water heater and the slow burn of realization settling in my chest. He'd shown me exactly where the wires had been sliced. Not chewed through, not frayed, sliced. Clean, intentional cuts. I didn't cry. I didn't panic. I didn't even feel surprised, and that's what bothered me most. I went back upstairs and stood in my kitchen, the same one Brianna once called claustrophobic. My son was in his room building a space station out of Legos. He had no idea what had almost gone wrong in the house I was supposed to keep safe. And the more I thought about it, the more that silence, that comfortable, innocent silence, made my blood boil. I waited 2 days before I did anything. I didn't tell my son. I didn't tell my parents. I needed to be sure I wasn't reacting on emotion. But deep down I already knew who it was. There were only 2 people who had reason to be that petty. And only one of them knew exactly where the breaker panel was. On the 3rd morning I drove to my parents' house. Their front lawn still had the same reindeer decorations they'd used since the 90s. I remember being a kid helping my dad drive the stakes into the frozen ground. Now looking at them, all I saw was forced cheer. Brianna's SUV was in the driveway. Her husband's truck too. I parked behind them and got out. My mom opened the door before I could knock. She asked me if I was here to talk. I said I was. Her eyes flicked behind me to the car, probably looking for my son. I told her I came alone. I walked past her and into the living room like I used to do 100 times before. Only this time, Brianna was stretched out on the couch with one of my old blankets wrapped around her legs, eating from a bowl of cereal like she was still living in my house. She looked up and gave me this look. Smug, flat, not even curious. Like she'd been waiting. I asked her if she had anything she wanted to say to me. She blinked, dragged her spoon across the bowl and said she didn't have time for drama. I told her someone damaged the electrical panel in my house. That it wasn't accidental. That someone had intentionally cut the wires. Dangerous ones. Wires that could have started a fire. She didn't answer. Just slowly kept eating like I wasn't there. I stepped closer. I asked her again if she had something to say. That's when she finally looked up at me and said, real calm, almost bored. Maybe your house is just as broken as you are. The slap happened before I even registered I'd moved. It was sharp and quick, and the sound of it echoed in that stupid, overly decorated living room. My mom screamed my name like I'd just committed a felony. My dad stood up from the recliner but didn't say anything, he just watched. Brianna didn't cry. She didn't say anything. She just held her cheek and stared at me like she couldn't believe I had the nerve. My mom got between us, begged me to apologize. Said this wasn't the way. That we were family. I told her no. I told her the wiring in my house had been tampered with and that her daughter was sitting here pretending like nothing happened. I asked her if a fire would have been family business too. She told me I had no proof. I looked right at Brianna and said I didn't need proof. I knew, and so did she. Then I left. Got in my car and drove straight home, hands shaking. Not from regret. Not from fear. From the rawness of finally doing what I should have done years ago. That night the phone started ringing. First my mom. Then my aunt from Ohio who I hadn't spoken to since 2018. Then a cousin who suddenly decided they cared deeply about the state of my mental health. Brianna had started the pity parade, told everyone I hit her, told them I'd lost control, and was having some kind of breakdown. People started messaging me saying they were praying for me. Someone asked if I'd thought about therapy. Someone else asked if I'd apologize before New Year's so the family could move on. I blocked 6 people that night. My son came into the room later holding his sketch pad. He asked if we were still doing our Christmas movie night. I said yes, of course. We watched Home Alone on the couch under our own blanket in our own house. The lights stayed on. The wiring didn't spark. It was the first night I finally felt like the house belonged to me again. But I knew it wasn't over. The silence after everything felt wrong. Too neat. Too controlled. For a few days nothing happened. No calls. No texts. My mom didn't check in. My dad didn't send one of his awkward thumbs-up messages. It was like I'd been erased. And that should have felt peaceful, but instead it made my skin crawl. I focused on my son. That part was easy. We baked cookies, the kind that spread too much but still tasted good. We watched space videos and old Christmas movies. He laughed more than he had in weeks. He stopped asking if he was in trouble. That alone told me I'd done the right thing. Then on a gray Tuesday morning there was a knock at the door. Not the doorbell. A firm official knock. I opened it to a man holding a clipboard. He introduced himself as a city inspector. He said he was there because a complaint had been filed about electrical work done without permits. My stomach dropped, but I kept my face neutral. I told him I hadn't done any electrical work. He said that was fine, he just needed to take a look. While he checked the panel, he asked how long I'd lived there. Who else had access? Whether there had been recent disputes. His tone was calm, but the questions weren't random. I told him the truth. That family had recently moved out. That someone had damaged the wiring before I called an electrician. I showed him the invoice, the photos, everything. He nodded, wrote notes, and said it looked like the damage had been done intentionally before any repairs. Before leaving, he paused and said something I didn't expect. Whoever reported this didn't do themselves any favors. Then he left. I closed the door and just stood there, letting the quiet settle again. Brianna didn't just want to hurt me emotionally. She wanted leverage. Paper trails. Trouble. She wanted me stressed, second-guessing myself, scared. That night, I emailed the electrician and asked for a written statement. I printed copies and filed everything away. I stopped assuming this was a family issue and started treating it like what it was. Someone trying to protect their ego by burning bridges behind them. A few days later, a letter arrived from my parents. An actual letter. Handwritten. My mom's looping cursive filled the page. She wrote about how heartbroken she was. How families shouldn't fall apart like this. How she couldn't choose between her daughters. She invited me to a New Year's dinner. A fresh start, she called it. There was no mention of the wiring. No mention of my son. No acknowledgement of what Brianna said at the table. Just an invitation to pretend. I folded the letter and put it in a drawer. I didn't respond. The next contact came from Brianna's husband. A single text. You think you won. You don't know everything. I didn't reply. I blocked the number. But that message stuck with me longer than I wanted to admit. The unexpected part came the next evening while I was helping my son look for old photos for a school project. We were digging through the hall closet, pulling down dusty albums I hadn't touched since before the move. One album felt heavier than it should have. Inside the back cover, tucked behind the last page, was a folded piece of paper. It was Brianna's handwriting. I knew it immediately. The note was dated 2 years earlier. It said that living with me would drive her insane. That she'd never survive under my rules. And underneath, written later in darker ink, it said that if she played things right, she wouldn't have to worry about that. I sat on the floor holding that note, my heart pounding, not because I was shocked, but because suddenly everything made sense. The entitlement. The confidence. The way she acted like my house was already hers. This wasn't desperation. This was expectation. I put the note in a sleeve and locked it away with my important documents. I didn't tell my parents about it. I didn't tell anyone. Some things you don't reveal right away. You keep them safe. You wait. That night, as I tucked my son into bed, he asked me if we were still spending Christmas alone. I told him yes. And for the first time I meant it as a promise, not a loss. New Year's came and went. No apologies. No confessions. Just silence so loud it had its own weight. We didn't go to the family dinner. I didn't send a polite excuse or a fake holiday smile. I simply didn't show up. And somehow that one act, doing nothing, caused more noise than anything else I'd done. The next day my mom left a voicemail. Her voice shook the entire way through. She didn't ask how I was, didn't ask about my son. She said she was devastated. and that she didn't understand why I was isolating myself, that I was hurting everyone, that I'd let bitterness poison the family. She said I was putting my son in the middle. That one really hit me, because for the first time in this whole mess, it was clear, she didn't even realize who she'd been protecting all along. What she didn't know, what she probably still doesn't, is that my son had been sleeping better, that he smiled more, that he didn't flinch every time someone raised their voice in the hallway. That night he asked me if we could start decorating the house just for us next year. He said, "It's finally our house again." So no, I wasn't putting him in the middle. I was pulling him out of it. But I should have known Brianna wouldn't stop. People like her don't leave quietly, they just find new stages. 3 days after that voicemail, I got a message from a woman I hadn't talked to since a wedding 5 years ago. She sent me a screenshot from Brianna's private Facebook account. A long, teary post about being thrown out during the holidays by someone she tried to help, complete with blurry photos of her kids sitting on a motel bed looking bored. The comments made my blood run cold. People asking where they could send money. A woman commenting, "Some sisters are just born broken." Someone else, "No one deserves what you're going through. Especially not those boys." She made herself the victim. But this time it was public. Then came the calls from family. A cousin from Oregon asking me if I had snapped. An uncle I barely knew asking if it was true I'd hit Brianna and then told her kids they were worthless. Another asked if I'd kicked them out because I was jealous. Jealous. That one stayed with me all day. I didn't answer any of them. I just sat down, pulled out the folder I'd been building and added the next page, a printed screenshot of her post. That night my phone buzzed with a number I didn't recognize. It was the electrician. He had finalized the report for the city, confirming the wiring had been tampered with before he was called, and that it showed signs of intentional damage. He said he'd gone ahead and submitted it to the inspection department to close the case. He also added that whoever made the complaint, and he was certain it was done out of spite, might want to think twice before filing false reports. I thanked him and hung up. Then I printed that too, filed it away. The next morning I drove back to my parents' house. This time I didn't wear a smile. I didn't come for peace. My dad opened the door and looked like he didn't know whether to hug me or call for help. I walked past him. My mom was in the kitchen. Brianna wasn't there. I don't know if she was hiding or just gone, but I didn't ask. I placed the folder on the dining table and opened it. The electrician's report. Photos of the damaged panel. A screenshot of Brianna's post. And at the bottom, a scan of the note I'd found in the photo album. I didn't yell. I just told them that if Brianna, her husband, or anyone on their behalf ever tried to spin another lie in public, I would make everything in that folder public too. I would file a report. I would show the city the note. I would go to the police if I had to. And then I said something I never thought I'd say to my own mother. Protecting someone like that makes you responsible too. She didn't argue. She didn't cry this time. She just stood there. 3 days later, someone texted me from a random number. It was a photo of Brianna sitting in a motel parking lot, smoking next to a busted stroller. The caption just said, "She's not doing great." No name. No explanation. I didn't respond. But for a second I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Then the next day I came home from work and noticed the garage smelled off. Bitter. Chemical. Almost metallic. I opened the door to the garage and saw it. A brown puddle under the water heater spreading slowly across the concrete. At first I thought it was rust or a small leak. But something was wrong. I knelt down and checked the valve. There was an oily residue around the pressure release. Not water. Something had been poured into it. The heater had been tampered with. I called the plumber. He came within the hour. After 5 minutes he looked at me and asked if I had enemies. He said someone poured something into the pressure valve. Something that could have caused the tank to rupture or even explode if it had built enough pressure. It hadn't happened yet. But it was close. I didn't cry. I just asked how fast we could replace it. He said he'd get a new one in by the end of the week. I went inside. Sat on the floor with my son and helped him finish a jigsaw puzzle of the solar system. We didn't talk about the garage. He didn't need to know. But I knew one thing now more than ever. This wasn't over because she hadn't been exposed. Not really. And some people, when they realize they've lost control, will burn everything they can reach on their way down. The plumber replaced the water heater within 5 days. He had to order a part from out of state. When he was done, he handed me the paperwork and said the kind of damage he found didn't just happen by mistake. Said it looked like someone had poured brake fluid into the valve. Something corrosive, not something you'd have sitting around by accident. I asked if I should report it. He gave me a look like he wanted to say yes but didn't want to get involved. Just said, if it were my kid in the house I would. That night after my son fell asleep, I went into the garage and just stood there, staring at the old heater now disconnected sitting by the wall like some kind of evidence. I thought about everything, the dinner, the slap, the lies, the motel. The fact that someone who'd once shared a room with me as a child had tried to make my home unsafe twice. And I thought about how close I'd come to letting her stay forever. That night I filed a police report. I didn't go public. I didn't post anything. But I sent the report number to my parents. No message. Just the number. My mom called twice. I didn't answer. She sent one text. Please don't do this. It'll ruin her. I didn't respond. Because if anyone was ruined, it wasn't because of me. After that, everything went quiet. For real this time. I didn't hear from Brianna. No surprise messages. No fake apologies. It was like she vanished. Someone told me they saw her working nights at a roadside diner near the interstate. Someone else said her husband left and moved back to Indiana. I didn't follow up. I didn't care. I was done carrying the weight of people who never carried anything for me. December rolled around again. Snow came early that year. The house stayed warm, safe, quiet. My son asked if we could get a real tree this time. We picked one out from a local farm, tied it to the top of the car, and he helped me drag it through the door, laughing the whole way. We decorated it with old mismatched ornaments. Some from when I was his age, some we'd made together last year. On Christmas Eve, he asked if we were still doing our usual dinner. I said no. This year would be different. Simpler. Just us. We made pizza from scratch. Burned the first one. Ate the second on the living room floor in front of the fireplace. He got root beer. I had wine. When he opened his gift, a telescope, he just stared at it for a second, then hugged me without saying a word. Later that night, after he went to bed, I sat on the couch with the lights dimmed, watching the snow fall through the front window. No drama. No yelling. No extra cars in the driveway. Just peace. The house had scars. So did I. But it was ours again. And I had finally learned something I should have known a long time ago. Blood isn't the same as loyalty. And sometimes the best thing you can do, for yourself, for your child, for the future, is to let the wrong people walk out and never let them back in. That was the first Christmas I spent alone with my son. It was the best one we ever had.